Order in the court. The judge's voice boomed through the filled chamber, rattling the walls as if justice itself was asking for quiet. All eyes in the gallery snapped up straight, hearts pounding, breaths frozen. The tension in the room was like fire contained in a glass bottle, waiting to burst with the slightest spark. The sound of camera clicks outside the courthouse reverberated dimly through the heavy doors, relentless as bullets, reminding everybody that this was no ordinary trial. It was a spectacle. A nation watched, and the world was soon to bear witness to the downfall, or redemption of one man. At the center of it all sat Kody Brown, his hair slicked back, his jaw clenched in defiance, his eyes switching between the jury and the women sitting behind him. Once, he was the face of a vast family empire, the proud patriarch of sister wives, celebrated and coveted by millions who watched to see his unorthodox life unfold on television. He had founded an empire on the ideals of unity, faith, and family. Yet now, that empire appeared to collapse around him. What had seemed like a man who had everything, wives, kids, land, and glory, now seemed like a man boxed in, vulnerable, accused of betrayal, financial dishonesty, and abandonment. Behind him sat his wives, past and present, on the benches. Christine, Janelle, and Meri refused to meet his eye, their faces marked by the type of pain that only years of shattered trust could etch. Their lips were pinched thin, their fists bunched tightly on their laps, every muscle in their bodies weighed down by betrayal. And then there was Robyn, the final wife to stand by his side. She leaned forward a little, her hand shaking, her face white but firm. Others questioned whether her devotion was love or denial. The air was thick with whispers. Journalists wrote furiously on their notebooks, their headlines already in the making. Fans of the series occupied the gallery, half of them hoping for justice to be served, half of them believing that Kody was being unjustly accused. Outside, protesters held signs, with half of them calling for freedom for Kody, the rest calling for justice for the women who had accused him of stealing their futures away. The judge's eyes scanned the courtroom. "This trial," he announced, "is not a TV show. This is not entertainment. This is the search for truth. And I will have order." His gavel came crashing down onto the wood, echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. There was silence that followed, a shaken, quivering silence. Kody fidgeted in his seat, his fingers drumming against the highly polished table. For a man who once ruled a household of close to 24, now he seemed strangely diminutive, relegated to one chair under the guard of the law. His lawyer leaned in toward him, saying something too low to hear, but Kody's jaw tightened further. His gaze darted again toward his wives, lingering momentarily upon Christine, who looked back with a mixture of sadness and determination. The prosecutor stood, a lanky man whose eyes bore into the air. His voice cut through the room, clear and calculated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you shall be presented with the tale of a trust shattered, of vows broken, and of a family dynasty constructed upon deceptions. The man in front of you, Kody Brown, was once the image of accord. But off camera, off stage, behind the image carefully constructed, he was secretly moving money around, playing games with those closest to him, and leaving behind a path of fiscal devastation and shattered hearts. This isn't about religion. This isn't about choice. This is about dishonesty. And after this trial, we will ask you to make him pay." Gasps spread through the gallery. The words dropped like rocks in water, creating shockwaves within the room. The prosecutor pointed to the evidence gathered on the table. Stacks of thick binders filled with financial reports, property deeds from Coyote Pass, and printed copies of emails promising harmony, but hinting at betrayal. The gravity of it all appeared to linger within the air, heavy and oppressive. Kody's lawyer was not a silver-tongued veteran of high-profile cases. He climbed to his feet with quiet aplomb. "This case," he declared smoothly, "is not a case of crime. It is a case of conflict. It is a case of rage, envy, and vengeance. My client is not guilty of fraud. He is guilty of being human. He is guilty of attempting and sometimes failing to keep intact a family of unimaginable dimensions and intricacy. The so-called victims you will be hearing from aren't innocent. They are actors in this feud. They are looking for revenge, not justice. The defense's words weighed heavy as well, but they were weighted differently, like a shield held up against arrows. Some of the jurors leaned back, weighing. Others squinted, suspicious. But the tension was real. This was not going to be an easy trial. This was going to be a battle of words. A war of truth and falsehood. A tale that would weave in and out until the very final verdict. Kody himself sat motionless, though his knuckles had gone white against the table. His mind raced, replaying years of decisions, years of arguments, years of promises he had made, but could not keep. He thought of Christine walking out, of Janelle demanding fairness, of Meri's silent heartbreak, of Robyn's unshakable loyalty. He thought of the children, his 18 children, watching from afar, some supporting, some condemning, all caught in the storm of their father's choices. And as the courtroom quieted again, the truth became apparent. This was not merely a battle of law. This was the destruction of a family dynasty. This was the moment when all the secrets, all the lies, all the whispered vows, would be brought into the open. The judge leaned forward, his gavel at the edge of his bench. The people are ready to proceed. In Mr. Prosecutor, call your first witness. A chill ran through the air. The first name would determine the tone for the rest. Whispers erupted in the gallery. Christine, with her strong independence, Janelle, with her acerbic tongue and quick recall of money matters, Meri, whose loyalty had turned to tears, or Robyn, split between loyalty and the truth. Kody's breath caught in his throat. His gaze flicked toward the door where witnesses sat, out of sight until their names were called. His heart was racing. His empire, reputation, and freedom all hung in the balance. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, looked at the jury, and then addressed them. The name that escaped his lips caused the courtroom to erupt into chaos. Gasps surrounded the air. The reporters almost jumped out of their seats. Kody's lawyer blinked in amazement. Kody froze, his chest constricted. He hadn't anticipated this. He hadn't prepared for this. The gravity of the trial weighed heavily upon him, and for the first time in years, the patriarch of sister wives seemed utterly helpless. The gavel came down a second time, calling for silence. But silence could not undo what had been done. The trial was underway, and Kody Brown's empire's reckoning was now inevitable. The prosecutor stood up slowly, his chair creaking against the highly polished wooden floor, with a sound that made the courtroom collectively stiffen. All eyes were fixed upon him. He was tall, measured, his face chiseled into stone, his eyes fixed on the 12 jurors, who would render judgment on the man seated mere feet away. He didn't hurry. He allowed the silence to hang, the tension to build until it was pressing against the chest of everyone like a heavy burden. It was only when he finally spoke that his voice came sharp and commanding. For years he started, his voice ringing across the chamber with accuracy. Kody Brown said his family was bound by faith. He paraded them in front of cameras, showed a perfectly choreographed image of harmony, and informed the world that his plural marriage was founded upon trust, love, and commitment. Behind the cameras, behind the smiles, however, the reality was much darker. Behind the veil of reality television, he was concealing bank accounts, moving money around, and keeping his wives, his self-proclaimed partners, blissfully in the dark. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is all about power. It is about greed, and most importantly, it is about broken promises. Gasps whispered through the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, typing headlines into their laptops without lifting their eyes from the prosecutor. The wives stiffened on their bench. Christine lowered her eyes. Janelle clenched her jaw. Meri's lips pressed thin, and Robyn shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twisting in her lap. The prosecutor wheeled and gestured toward the evidence table, where stacks of thick binders and boxes had been placed neatly in advance. "What you see here," he told them, his voice growing sharper, "is not rumor, it is evidence. Evidence of manipulation, evidence of deceit, evidence of a man who thought himself above the law because he ruled not just a home, but an empire. With careful movement, he picked up the first binder and walked to the jury box. He opened it slowly, each page crackling like thunder as he turned. Property deeds, he announced. Coyote Pass, the land which was to be a dream, an emblem of unity, a home for all the wife and child. But the dream was tainted from the beginning. While he was gathering power, making the arrangements so control would be his, they thought they were establishing a future together. He vowed fairness. He vowed equality. Instead, he manipulated a game that left them exposed and him impregnable. The jurors leaned forward. A couple nodded, their eyes squinting as they read the papers, passed down the bench. The prosecutor did not hesitate. He hit again, drawing another file from the pile. Financial transactions, he declared, his voice lifting. Secret accounts. Funds transferred in secret from shared holdings into single-name holdings. These were not insignificant oversights. These were calculated moves to ensure his future, while his wives thought they were doing the same for their children's. He waved a page of transaction records in front of him, the figures standing out in black print. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved without them even knowing, without them even asking. And when confronted, what did he do? He dodged. He played games. He made them think they were seeing things. Christine raised her head then, tears in her eyes, her mouth set in a grim line. Janelle exhaled sharply, shaking her head, her anger barely contained. Meri's shoulders sagged, as though the weight of years of denial had finally landed. And Robyn kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her loyalty tested with every word. The prosecutor's voice swelled louder, heated by the tidal wave of emotion that flowed through the court. But if documents of property transfer and money movement are insufficient, then let us go to the tapes. He stopped, allowing the air to thicken, and then set a small machine on the podium. The court waited. He pressed play. Kody's voice resonated throughout the room, deep and assured, recorded in a conversation not for the public ear. They'll never get it. I'll keep it all together. I have to. If I give them too much, the whole thing breaks down. They'll have what I let them have. That's the way it is. The words struck like a hammer. Gasps filled the air. One woman in the gallery covered her mouth with her hand in shock. A reporter let his pen fall. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his face tightening. Each shred of evidence, the prosecutor went on, unrelenting, presents not the image of a father or husband, but of a manipulator. A man who used his power not to lift up, but to intimidate. A man who vowed love yet brought control. A man who used religion and family for personal benefit. He spun then slowly, theatrically, pointing toward Kody. This is the defendant before us today, and this is the man who needs to be held responsible. Kody remained still, but his face gave him away. His jaw was clenched, his nostrils flared, his eyes flashed with rage and desperation. His lawyer wrote on a piece of paper and pushed it over to him, but Kody did not reach out to take it. His eyes were fixed on the jury, seeking a glimmer of compassion, of uncertainty, of anything that might salvage his fate. The jurors' expressions were impassive, but their eyes blazed with intensity. Some wrote down notes. Others crossed their arms and reclined as if to put distance between themselves and the man being painted. One female juror leaned her head to one side, lips pressed together, eyes narrowed as if she was listening to Kody's voice over and over in her mind. The prosecutor didn't relent. He paced deliberately, each step sounding like a drumbeat of fate. This trial is not about polygamy. It is not about lifestyle. It is about lying. It is about betrayal. It is about a man who thought that because he was at the center of a television series, because millions of viewers saw him each week, he could do whatever he wanted. But the cameras aren't here to guard him anymore. The cameras are here to expose him, and the evidence will not leave any doubt. There was a silence that descended on the courtroom as he walked back to his table. The binders stayed with the jury, their pages filled with signatures and numbers that spoke of manipulation more condemning than any words might. The device still rested on the podium. Quiet now, but its resonance in every head persisted. They'll get what I allow them to have. The judge cleared his throat, shattering the silence. The prosecution will proceed with presenting evidence in due course, he announced forcefully, though his voice betrayed the gravity of what had just been uttered. The jury will ignore emotion and center on fact. His gavel tapped once, not with thunder, but with the insistent reminder of order. Nevertheless, no one in that courtroom could pretend otherwise. The wives shifted once more, Christine leaning over and whispering something to Janelle, Meri using a tissue to wipe away tears. Robyn's grip on her knee so tight that her knuckles whitened. The gallery hummed softly, the whispers spilling like a crack in the dam. Reporters already had enough for tomorrow's headlines. Kody Brown exposed in secret recordings. Yet, the prosecutor was not finished. He sat forward, hands on the table, eyes still fixed on the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, today's hearing is just the tip of the iceberg. In the coming days, you will learn from the women themselves. You will learn how his promises became shackles, how his words became weapons, how their lives were taken apart piece by piece. You will see the papers, the transfers, the secret deals. And when you tie it all together, you will see the truth. Not the man on TV, not the man in the meticulously staged family portraits, but the man sitting in front of you today, exposed. The sentences lingered in the air, heavy and absolute. The prosecutor settled into his seat, his chair scraping into position with a harsh click. The tension that hung between them was stifling, punctuated only by the scratch of pens and the relentless thrum of hearts pounding too rapidly. The gavel came down once more. The judge turned to the defense. "Counsel, you may reply." But at that moment, no one was interested in the defense. Everyone's eyes were still glued to Kody Brown, the man who had once been applauded as a husband and father, now being called a manipulator who shed his veneer. The flames of the prosecution's opening inferno had been kindled and burned through every nook and cranny of the courtroom, leaving nothing but smoke, distrust, and the anticipation of even grimmer things to come. Kody's lawyer approached with the poise that could only be gained through years of practice in courtrooms, where reputations were held on threads. His suit was crisp, his tie precisely knotted, his shoes shining under the harsh lights that descended on the defense table. His movements were slow, deliberate, a subdued performance intended to be a counterpoint to the blaze of fury the prosecution had just awakened. When he stood at the podium, he rested one hand on it, calmly eyeing the jury. His words, when they came, were smooth, steady, and radiantly confident. "This is not a crime," he said, his voice cutting through the dense quiet like a surgeon's scalpel. "This is a family quarrel masquerading as a trial. It is a tale of wounded feelings, bitterness, and broken relationships. But it is not fraud. It is not deception in the guise the prosecution would have you think. What we see here is not criminal conduct. What we are witnessing here is the agonized disintegration of a family that just so happened to be under the public eye. And now, that disintegration has been distorted into allegations of crime." He allowed the words to hang, his eyes scanning slowly from one juror to another. Each one bristled under his scrutiny, the deliberate intensity that demanded they consider the case in another light, to move beyond the smoke and flames of the prosecution's story. "These women," he went on, his voice going soft as if he were breaking bad news to a child, "are not victims of crime. They are bitter, hurt ex-wives on a mission for revenge. They are recounting to you tales colored not with fact, but with heartache. Ask yourselves, how many times have divorces, breakups, or family fights ended in claims that sounded outrageous, overstated, or one-sided? This is what this is. A family feud having spilled into this courtroom, masquerading as a criminal case." He hesitated, looking momentarily at Kody, rigid and still, his features impassive, but his eyes smoldering with silent thankfulness. The lawyer faced the jury again, and waved his hand in a gentle arc toward the line of women on the benches. "Consider them. Do they appear to be victims of fraud, or do they appear to be individuals who feel betrayed, abandoned, and angry? Their suffering is genuine, I do not refute it, but pain is not evidence of wrongdoing. Sorrow is not tantamount to lying, and tears do not make evidence where there is none." His words had the cadence of honed argument. The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some scowling, others cocking their heads slightly as if seeking the validity of his reasoning. The wives responded otherwise. Christine's eyes burned with indignation, her lips parting as though she wanted to leap from her seat and scream a rebuttal. Janelle's arms crossed tightly across her chest, her body tense, her jaw clenched. Meri's lips trembled, her face pale but determined, as if she were holding back an ocean of emotion. And Robyn? Robyn's gaze flicked over to Kody, then down to her lap, her hands writhing as if she were fighting over and over with imaginary shackles. The lawyer noticed their faces and grabbed the instant. He leaned forward a bit, dropping his voice just enough so the jury had to tilt toward him. Look at their faces. This is not the face of individuals recounting objective realities. This is the appearance of those whose wounds are new, whose scars are deep, and who are making this test a field of battle for feelings. Ask yourselves, if this were really all about money, about lies, about crime, why did it take so many years to come to light? Why now, when the marriages have fallen apart, when loyalties had changed, when anger had congealed into resentment, why now, if not for revenge? He stood up, his voice growing again with passion. My client, Kody Brown, has done one thing and one thing only, trying to keep a complex family together in situations none of you can even begin to comprehend. 18 children, 4 wives, 1 home fragmented by jealousy, competition, and the stress of living life on the show business microscope. He erred, he struggled, he made decisions some of you don't agree with. But they don't make him a criminal, they make him human. The jurors shared hushed looks. Some nodded barely perceptible nods. Others stood unmoving, pens scratching down notes on pads as they took in each word. The attorney allowed his argument to build, layer upon layer, creating not only a defense but a tale, a counter-narrative to the prosecutor's blaze. Let me be clear, he went on, his voice now abrupt, word after word landing like blows. The prosecution has made my client out to be a manipulator, a cheater, a man who used power to destroy the people nearest him. But what have they demonstrated? Paperwork, transfers, words taken out of context, recordings that do not reveal the complete picture. They would have you think that disputes over property, over money, over broken promises, are fraud. But in families this size especially, disputes over those things are commonplace. Property is distributed unfairly, money is moved, promises are broken. That is family tragedy, not the signature of crime. He moved over towards the jury box, his hand on the rail, light, his voice again soothing. Consider your own families. Consider the fights you have had with loved ones, over inheritances, over money, over who was entitled to what. Were those crimes, or were they the messy, painful, human nuances of relationships? That is what we are confronted with here. Messy, painful, human reality, not fraud, not theft, not criminal deception. Behind him, the wives shifted again. Christine shook her head, her hands gripping each other tightly in her lap. Janelle exhaled heavily, whispering something under her breath. Meri's eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall, and Robyn pressed her lips together, her entire body rigid as though she were trying to keep herself from collapsing. Their faces said otherwise, one of sorrow, of betrayal, of hurts unhealed. But the attorney's words cut through, describing those feelings as suspect, as proof not of wrongdoing but of resentment. He stepped back to the podium, his voice firm now, controlled. The prosecution wishes for you to feel. They wish for you to hear for yourselves, tears and gasps, and let your hearts decide. But the law is not concerned with feelings. The law is concerned with facts, and the facts in this case are obvious. No laws were violated, no fraud was perpetrated. What transpired here was a disintegration of a family that lived for too long under the lens of cameras and the burden of unrealistic expectations. And now, those private tragedies are being manipulated into a story of crime. His tone dropped low once more, close, near pleading. Don't be misled by injustice, masquerading as justice. Don't let rage be proof. Don't let sorrow be guilt. My client is better than this. You, the jury, are better than this. And the truth is better than this. He slowly took a step back, leaving room for the silence to fill. The jurors' faces were impassive, but their eyes trailed after him as he took his seat next to Kody again. The patriarch sat rigid, lips clamped into a thin line, his chest heaving like he was holding his breath. His lawyer leaned in close to him, speaking softly into his ear. Kody nodded the slightest, his shoulders relaxing but ever so slightly, the burden of the prosecutor's flame partly lifted by the defense of his words. But on the other side of the courtroom, the wives' faces were another story. Their eyes blazed, their lips quivered, their hearts cried out in silence. This was not a family feud to them. This was not bitterness. This was truth. Agonizing, irrefutable truth. And they would not let it be silenced. The gavel came down, demanding order again. The voice of the judge cut through the strain. We will hear from the witnesses. And with that, the defense wall was ready. But the storm of testimony was just about to break, threatening that however smooth the language, the truth would shortly come crashing in. Christine's heels clicked delicately on the wooden floor as she made her way to the stand, each step ringing out in a volume that seemed too great for it. The room was hushed, and so still that even the rustle of papers seemed like thunder. She sat down, her hands shaking as she swore under oath, her glance flickering for an instant toward Kody before settling on the mountain of bills in her lap. When she finally opened her mouth to speak, her voice broke, not with weakness but with the accumulated weight of years, finally having to be heard. He promised, she stated, holding the papers aloft like sacred relics of betrayal. He promised to construct us a home together on Coyote Pass. He sketched for me such a beautiful vision, a future in which we might all live together, our children playing in the same location, our family at last reunited. And I believed him. I believed every word. Her voice trembled as she held the bills tighter, the figures layering from the worn paper. But while we made plans for unity, he had other plans in store. He wasn't building a home for us. He was constructing control for himself. Gasps spread across the gallery. Christine's words were not accusations but confessions of disappointment, the sort that sliced into flesh deeper than any monetary loss ever could. The jurors leaned forward, eyes scanning the papers being distributed, ears eager for every morsel she had to share. She went on, her tears running down unheeded. I worked for this. I sacrificed for this. I stood by him when nobody else would. And what did I receive? Deceit, lies. He led us to think that we were part of something divine, but it was never about faith, never about family. It was all about power. Her tone turned hard then, with anger. He diminished me in my own marriage, made me invisible in my own home. And when I finally did see the truth, that I was constructing his vision, not mine, it was too late. The harm was done. Kody fidgeted uncomfortably at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his eyes scrunched up. His lawyer scribbled on a notepad. But the harm that Christine had done with her testimony was obvious. The jury wasn't just hearing, they were feeling, and that was far more deadly than any document. The prosecutor nodded, pleased, and proceeded to call the next name. Janelle stood up from her chair with a resolve that seemed to rumble the air around her. Where Christine's suffering had been tentative and quivering, Janelle's had been keen and unyielding. She walked with the deliberation of one who had waited long for this moment. When she stepped into the witness box, she didn't waste time on amenities. I put my money in, she stated, resolutely, her voice slicing the air like a knife. My savings, my future, my security, I spent it all on that property, because he said it was for us. He said we were creating something permanent, something for the kids, something we could leave behind. I trusted him because he was my husband. Because I trusted him. She leaned forward, eyes flashing as they locked onto Kody, and he left me with nothing but shattered trust. The jurors changed again, their pens scratching with furious intensity. Janelle went on, her words a vengeful hurricane. Do you have any idea how it feels to wake up and see that your dreams are a lie? To see the man you've spent your life with creating an exit strategy rather than building a life? I do. Every cent I worked for, every adjustment I made, I thought I did it for our family. I did it for him. Always for him. Her fists curled on the stand, her voice shaking with controlled fury. He taught us to sacrifice, to persevere, to put family above all. But the only family that ever really counted to him was the one which granted him the most power. I don't care what anyone tells me. He stole from us, not just money, but years we can never recover. Kody looked away from her, fixed on the table, his expression inscrutable. Robyn shifted restively next to him, her fingers wrapped tight around the armrest as if clinging for balance. Then the quietest of footsteps. Meri? She stood up very slowly, her legs heavy, her eyes cast down. The light in the room seemed to fade as she sat on the witness stand, her shoulders burdened with memories she had borne too long. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke, but it traveled farther than Christine's anger or Janelle's passion. It was the voice of one who had been broken, one whose pain was no longer new but deeply scarred. He made me believe, she started, her lips shaking, her tears running down her face. He made me believe that I still had a home. He made me believe I was a part of this family, even when his love had already gone. He told me to wait, to hope, to hold on. And I did. For years I did. The jury remained silent, entranced. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was heavy. They seeped with sorrow, with betrayal that sliced into the bone of her existence. I pleaded for crumbs of affection, for a gesture that I counted, but what he did was bar the door forever. Do you have any idea what it is like to be erased while remaining in the same room? To exist as a specter in your own marriage? She shook her head slowly, tears glistening under the courtroom lights. I do. I lived it. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent. Not even the clicking of pens, not even the shuffle of feet. The weight of Meri's pain pressed down on everyone like a suffocating blanket. Even the judge, stern and unflinching, lowered his gaze briefly. The prosecutor's voice broke the silence gently. "Thank you," he said. He did not need to prod any further. The wives' statements had spoken for themselves, each different in tone, but the same in message. Betrayal, loss, deception. Kody's lawyer jumped up fast, determined to catch up. He grilled on Cross with pointed, direct questions, attempting to couch the testimonies in terms of exaggeration as the sourness of failed marriages. "Mrs. Brown," he interrogated, "isn't it the case that you left voluntarily? Isn't it the case that many of these choices were joint decisions? Isn't there a possibility that your hurt is tainting your recollection of what happened?" But the wives stood firm. Christine's eyes flashed with defiance. Janelle's voice cut back with unwavering clarity. Meri's quiet sorrow became unshakable truth. Every answer, every word, only seemed to strengthen the prosecution's case. Before the gavel fell to adjourn the session, the courtroom was different. The air was thick, the quiet loud. The jurors' faces were impassive, but their eyes were revealing. They had been shaken, stirred, maybe even persuaded. Kody was seated rigidly, his hands locked so tightly his knuckles turned white. His empire, which had been held together by belief and the illusion of unity, now rested in fragments, destroyed by the voices of the same women who had stood with him. And as the wives walked back to their seats, their shoulders squared, their heads lifted high, the reality couldn't be denied. Every testimony was harder than the last, and collectively they had delivered a blow no defense could easily erase. Robyn stood slowly from her seat, her hands shaking just enough for the cameras to notice. The scuffle of her shoes on the smooth floor rang out louder than it should have, as if the whole room was bending forward to take each step, each breath. She seemed smaller than she had on TV, without the warm smile of editing and the easy support of Kody beside her. She was alone now, stepping into the witness box, confronted by a sea of eyes that demanded truth. The bailiff administered the oath to her, and her voice trembled ever so slightly as she replied, "I do." She took a seat, her back straight, her hands nodding in her lap. For an instant she did not glance at anybody, neither at the prosecutor, nor at the jury, nor at the man seated at the defense table who was regarding her with unflinching focus. At last her eyes flashed up to Kody, and then away again, swiftly, like a moth that was terrified of the flame it could not resist. The prosecutor moved deliberately, not wanting to stand too close. "Mrs. Brown," he started, his voice firm but controlled, "you remain the sole wife married to Kody Brown, aren't you?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice hardly audible. She cleared her throat, working strength into her voice. "Yes, I am. And you've stuck with him even when the others abandoned him." "Yes," she said it more resolutely this time, although her hands continued to wring in her lap. The prosecutor nodded. "Well then explain this to this jury. Explain why, when Christine, Janelle, and Meri have all come forward and testified that your husband manipulated them, deceived them, and left them penniless. You remain seated beside him. Robyn's eyes flashed again, first to Kody, then to the jury, then to her lap. She took a deep breath, her shoulders lifting, her voice shaking but firm. Because he's a good man, she said at last. Kody is a good man, but people make mistakes. He didn't steal from us. He was trying to help us. There was a murmur in the gallery. Some heads shook with incredulity. Others leaned forward as if grasping for her every sentence. Even the jurors responded. Some writing with furious intensity, others shooting each other looks. Robyn went on, her voice firmer now, but cracks running through her tone. The land at Coyote Pass. It was complicated. He was attempting to make it work for all of us. But nothing is ever going to be perfect in a family as big as this. The money. We didn't always see eye to eye, but I never thought he was attempting to harm us. He wanted to preserve what we had, keep it from falling apart. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, his tone sharpening. So you're saying the documents we've presented, the transfers, the hidden accounts, the recordings, those don't show deception, they show protection. Yes? Robyn's reply was quick, too quick, as though rehearsed in her head 100 times. But as the word left her lips, her eyes flickered again, betraying the very doubt her voice tried to conceal. The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone low, deliberate. Mrs. Brown, are you defending him, or are you defending yourself for still standing by him? The question slammed like a hammer. People gasped. Robyn's lips parted, but no sound escaped. The courtroom hummed, whispers rising like storm waves. She finally managed to say, her voice cracking, "I'm telling you the truth." But the truth in her voice was broken, like pressure-cracked glass. The prosecutor retreated, allowing the silence to hang, allowing her discomfort to insinuate itself into the jurors' heads. No further questions, he said icily, taking his seat. Kody's lawyer sprang to his feet at once, striding towards the witness stand with a gentler look, his tone soothing and measured. Robyn, he spoke softly, you lived with Kody. You've known him day in and day out. Long after the cameras weren't there any longer. You think he ever set out to cheat anyone? No, she replied hastily, relief dancing in her eyes at the gentler tone. I don't. Kody is not an ideal man, but he never meant to harm us. He was attempting to keep order in a family no one else could have held together. It was bedlam, day after day. He tried to impose order. And do you love him? Asked the attorney softly. Yes, Robyn replied, her voice shaking once more, but with emotion instead of fear. Yes, I love him. There were some jurors who looked away, not meeting her gaze. Others examined her intently, looking for honesty. Was this devotion? Was this refusal? Or was it the final tenuous strand of a woman who had wagered everything on one man and couldn't possibly let him go now? The defense counsel smiled warmly and replied, "Thank you, no further questions." Robyn descended, blanched, her eyes glassy, making her way back towards her seat. The room hummed more raucously than ever before. Half of the observers saw loyalty, an unwavering partner standing up for her husband amid the tempest. The other half viewed denial, a woman so caught up in his manipulation she could no longer discern truth from fantasy. Kody touched out as she sat next to him, his hand briefly covering hers. She winced, almost by reflex, before allowing it to remain so. Her mouth flattened into a tight line, her body tense as if even the pleasure of touch was paid with the burden of duty. The wives on the opposite bench stared at her, their eyes telling stories words could not. Christine's look was sharp, almost pitying. Janelle's was filled with fire, her lips pressed tight as though holding back biting words. Meri's gaze was softer, sadder, as though she recognized in Robyn the same woman she had once been, clinging to hope even as it slipped through her fingers. The jury made their faces unreadable by scribbling down their thoughts, but the questions in their eyes were unmistakable. Was Robyn a witness to truth? Or the final victim in Kody's spiderweb? Was she defending him? Or defending herself? And as the gavel came down to close the day's session, the reverberations remained. The courtroom hummed with opposing whispers, loyalty, denial, love, deceit. Robyn's testifying had not exonerated Kody, nor had it convicted him. It had done something much more risky. It had left everyone wondering whose truth they were listening to. Finally, Kody himself stood up. For hours he had been seated rigid at the defense table. His tension wound tighter than a spring, his eyes darting between wife and jury and judge, as witness after witness chipped away at his persona. Now at last, it was time for him to take the stand. The creak of his chair on the floor was like a drumroll, drawing every eye in the room towards him. He straightened his spine, pulled his suit jacket smooth, and strode towards the witness stand with the rigid dignity of a man who had talked himself into believing that this was not his moment of failure, but his moment of redemption. The words of the oath were spoken, and he swore them in a voice that held just enough steel to cover the shake that lay underneath. He sat down in the chair, his hands clasped tightly around the wood of the armrests, so that his knuckles turned white. His hair was pulled back from his face, his jaw thrust forward, his eyes burning with the sort of fire that was not born of conviction, but of desperation. "I adored my family," he asserted, the sound of his voice echoing with the intensity of practiced conviction. "I labored to provide for them more than I ever had. I provided them with opportunity, I provided them with comfort, I provided them with safety from a world that never appreciated us." He leaned a fraction forward, eyes fixed on the jury. "Yes, I made decisions. Yes, I damaged feelings. I'll admit to that. I am not perfect. And I never said otherwise. But don't blur heartbreak with crime. Don't confuse disappointment with duplicity. I am not guilty of thievery. I am guilty only of failure as a husband." The words lingered in the air, quivering on the edge of pride and confession. In the jury box, some of the jurors shifted, their heads nodding dully, as if acknowledging the weakness of a man confessing imperfection. Others shook their heads, their lips set into unforgiving lines, refusing to believe his words were anything other than calculated act. The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, face neutral. The defense attorney smiled weakly, hopefully, as if urging his client silently to come on, to lean into the tale of an undeservedly maligned man, rather than an evil one. Kody drew in a breath, his chest rising with the effort to keep himself together. "Do you know what it's like to bear the burden of 18 children? 4 wives, to be the one to keep it all from falling apart? Every decision I made was because I believed it to be best for the family. Did I always get it right? No. Did I sometimes do things on my own? Yes. But that doesn't make me a criminal. It makes me a man trying to do the impossible." He shifted his gaze to Christine, whose eyes blazed at him from the bench. "Christine says that I betrayed her, but I devoted years of my life to her, and together we had children we both should be proud of. She wanted a dream house, and yes, I told her things that never happened, but dreams fall down. That doesn't mean I stole from her. That means that I let her down in her heart, not in her bank account." Janelle fidgeted in her seat, arms folded, jaw clenched, but Kody continued. "Janelle says I stole her future. But Janelle is tougher than anybody I have ever met. She invested in our property because she had faith in it, because she had faith in me. And I had faith in us too. The fact that it failed doesn't mean it was a con. It means life unraveled. We've all seen it happen. That isn't theft, that's tragedy." And lastly, his glance rested on Meri, who stared at her lap, silent tears falling. His tone mellowed. "Meri, she says I closed the door to her. But that door had been closing a long time. It wasn't just me, it was both of us. I never lost affection for her. I never wanted her to feel erased. But marriages end, and sometimes there's no salvaging them. That is not a crime. It is a heartbreak." The courtroom hung silent, caught in the weight of his words. Some of his listeners leaned forward, attracted to the pathos in his voice, the way he positioned himself as an imperfect man, drowning under the pressure of unreasonable standards. Others bristled, unimpressed, their minds ringing with the wives' words of manipulation, secrecy and betrayal. Then Kody's tone hardened, growing louder, his pride bleeding through. "The prosecution has depicted me as some sort of mastermind, some plotter who sat in the background string pulling, lying, cheating, deceiving. But ask yourself, does that make sense? If I was so manipulative, so calculating, would I have laid it all out there for years in front of cameras? Millions of people watched our lives. watched our hardships. Everything was open. You believe I could hide something in that world? No, that was real. A family attempting to survive. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow slightly, but the jurors were all ears. I'm not the monster you want to think I am, Kody continued, his voice thickening with emotion. I'm a father who worked himself to the point of exhaustion to feed and clothe 18 children. I'm a husband who tried, and failed, to keep 4 marriages alive simultaneously. I'm a man who believed too much in dreams that couldn't hold up to reality. That's my crime, being foolish enough to think I could hold it all together. He hesitated, swallowing hard, his hand shaking as he lifted it for a moment, then let it drop again. Some of you believe I was arrogant. Some of you believe I loved one wife better than the other, or that I promised things I was unable to keep. You are right, I did. But pride, favoritism, disappointment, those are not offenses, they are weaknesses. And if weaknesses make a man criminal, then all of us should be in court. His words caused murmurs, some of consent, others of incredulity. The defense lawyer leaned forward, in a whisper. Good, continue. Kody's gaze swept the courtroom, sealing onto the gallery, the press, strangers' faces that would take his tail outside these doors. I stand before you charged with betrayal, manipulation, theft. But all I ever sought was to preserve my family unit. Perhaps I did fail. Perhaps I did fail rather grandly. But failure is not fraud. Agony is not evidence. And tears, no matter how many flow, do not amount to guilt. He leaned back in the witness chair, his chest rising and falling, his eyes burning with the rage of a man cornered but not broken. Some of the jurors wrote notes wildly, others crossed arms and leaned back, and others exchanged impenetrable glances. The room was split, hearts torn between sympathy and distrust. The judge cleared his throat. Mr. Brown, you may step down. Kody hesitated, his glance darting towards Robyn, who afforded him the slightest of nods. He stood, smoothing his jacket, and returned to his seat. The gravity of his words hung there, heavy and unfinished. It was said that some thought they had just heard the confession of a shattered man who had been judged too stringently. It was said that others had just heard the performance of a lifetime. And with the gavel falling to mark the end of the day, one thing was certain, the jury's hearts and minds were now war terrain. The prosecution wasn't finished yet. The lawyer stood up again, his step measured, his gaze on the jury as if he was about to show the final card in a high-stakes game. He hesitated, his fingers curled around the rim of the table, allowing the silence to become heavy between them. All the people in the courtroom sensed it, the anticipation, the tension, the feeling that something tragic was going to hit them. He cleared his throat and spoke in measured calm. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've heard up to now, testimonies, documents, broken promises, these are potent, yes. But today, I'm going to tell you something irrefutable, something that dispels all uncertainty. He reached into a battered black folder, the edges frayed from repeated use, and drew out a thin pile of printed sheets. He dropped them on the table with a sharp slap, then raised the top sheet. The room hunched forward, eyes going wide, hearts racing. These, the prosecutor announced, holding the page up high for the jury to notice, are emails written by Kody Brown himself, not hearsay, not assumptions, his own words. And in these words, he admits to transferring family money into accounts only under his name. The courtroom gasped as though a collective punch had landed. Christine's hand flew to her chest, her jaw tightening in fury. Janelle's arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed thin, her body vibrating with restrained anger. Meri's head dropped, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. And Robyn, loyal trembling Robyn, went pale, her lips parting in shock, her body leaning back as if the evidence had physically struck her. The prosecutor didn't finish there. He walked over to a miniature speaker on the podium and pushed a button. The room was filled with the unmistakable tone of Kody's voice, recorded in a tape that cut more sharply than any witness. It's safer this way, the voice announced, low and assured. If all the money's in my name, they can't split it, they can't lay hands on it. I'll have control. I must. They don't know how to manage it. If they did, they'd fight me, and that would spoil it all. The words hung in the air like cigarette smoke, choking and irrevocable. Whispers broke out in the gallery, swelling into a tempest of sound. The judge pounded his gavel, commanding silence, but even his ringing blow struggled to pierce the turmoil. Reporters' pens scratched across pages, keys struck against laptops. The whole room filled with horror. The prosecutor banged his hand on the table, his words booming over the din. This is not love. This is not family. This is not protection. This is control. This is deception. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is evidence of guilt. Christine's eyes welled up with tears. But they were not the tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication, of rage at last getting its day. She leaned forward, her fingers wrapped around the bench with such intensity that her knuckles turned white. Janelle's head shook slowly, eyes cold, anger spreading across the room, like flame. Meri cried softly, the years of uncertainty now distilled into bitter confirmation. Robyn gazed at Kody, her eyes white, her lips shaking, her face torn between horror and the dreadful thought that she had stood up for a man who had betrayed not only the others, but her as well. Kody sat motionless, his eyes wide with horror, his face red with rage, then pale with shock. His lips opened in a silent cry, as if to say something, but no sound emerged. His lawyer leaned in over him, speaking urgently, whispering in his ear, but Kody did not move, his brain racing to escape from words that he could not refute. The prosecutor walked slowly in front of the jury, his voice measured but slicing. He told you that he was guilty of nothing but being a bad husband, that his sin was heartbreak, not lies. But what he said himself shows otherwise. He transferred money into his name only. He centralized control. He silenced his wives. This is not the error of a man swept away by family. This is the calculation of a man who wanted control no matter what. He stopped, allowing the words to take root. The jurors' faces were grim, their pens scratching angrily. Others shook their heads, their faces set as if the veil had been removed. Others gazed at Kody with something close to pity, the sort reserved for the soul who had constructed his own cell brick by brick. The prosecutor brought up the emails once more. In one email to a financial planner, he said, "Don't tell them, just keep it under my account. They'll only ask questions, and I don't owe them explanations." Is that the voice of a man attempting to shield his family, or is it the voice of a man who views his family as hurdles to be managed? The gallery burst into a commotion, half gasps and half murmurs. The judge rapped the gavel on the desk hard, his voice thundering, "Order, there will be order in this court." But order was not possible. The words had already sparked something too big to be quashed. The prosecutor pushed forward, his voice subsiding to a low, almost personal tone as he spoke to the jury. "You've heard the testimony. You've read the documents, and now you've heard him. His own words, uncensored, uncoached, undeniable. You don't have to imagine manipulation. You don't have to guess control. He said it. He schemed it. He carried it out. And now he sits before you, trying to tell you that heartbreak is innocence." He flung the last page down on the podium. But heartbreak doesn't move funds into hidden accounts. Heartbreak doesn't conceal assets. Heartbreak doesn't crave control. These are not the errors of a flawed husband. These are the deliberate choices of a guilty man. The silence that followed was choking, interrupted only by the gentle sobs of Meri and the trembling exhalation from Robyn, who finally turned her face away from Kody. For the first time in the trial, the patriarch who had once ruled over a family and a TV audience appeared completely helpless. His carefully constructed image of years was broken in the brief course of incriminating sentences and a single tape. The gavel came down once more, but this time even the judge's voice quivered beneath the enormity of what had been uncovered. "We will recess until tomorrow morning," he declared, though his eyes expressed the same notion running through the courtroom. The case had turned. The tide had changed. And as the jury filed out, the gallery abuzz with whispers, and the wives sat in their different states of anger, grief, and shock. One thing was certain. The bombshell had been dropped, and the smoke would not easily dissipate. The jury vanished behind the heavy wooden doors, and the lock snapped with a finality that made Kody's spine shiver. The air in the courtroom changed in an instant, as if the very breath of the air had been drawn off. Without the jury, the room seemed to fold inward on itself, shrinking to the constricted, worried breathing of the ones who were left behind. Hours became as long as years. The wives sat on their bench, each of them lost in her own tempest. Christine gazed at the ground, her hands clasped tightly so that her knuckles were white, her lips in silent grace or imprecation. It was impossible to say which. Janelle drummed her foot relentlessly, her arms locked in defense, her gaze on the clock that ticked ruthlessly above the door. Meri sat stiff, a crumpled tissue in her hand, her tears having run long ago, leaving only the empty burden of waiting. Robyn hunched forward, her head in her hands, shivering every few minutes, as if the quiet itself was eating into her. Kody sat at the defense table, his lawyer whispering reassurances, but the words fell by him unheard. He glared at the doors where the jury had disappeared, willing them to swing back open with the verdict he desired. His chest heaved in quick gasps, his jaw clenched so hard that it hurt. He'd spent years on TV, in front of bright lights, being judged by strangers by the millions, but he'd never felt the kind of judgment here. Meanwhile, in back of the doors, 12 strangers huddled in a small room, surrounded by piles of binders, coffee cups, and the weight of a decision too big for anyone to carry lightly. They debated, voices hard, then soft, then hard again. Is Kody a failed husband, or an imposter? One juror demanded, pounding his hand on the table. Another shook her head, her arms crossed. He confessed to moving the money. That's fraud. End of debate. No. Another juror responded, her voice laden with doubt. He sounded like a man grasping at control in chaos. That's not fraud. That's desperation. Don't mix the two up. They argued for hours. The coffee cups were drained and filled again. Scribbled pages were crossed off, rewritten. Some of the jurors walked back and forth across the room, their feet wearing tracks into the carpet. Others slumped in their seats, tired, their faces etched with the burden of having to decide between liberty and penalty for a man whose life had already fallen apart. Beyond the courthouse doors, the world was not holding its breath. There had been crowds, pouring over the sidewalks, carrying signs that divided the public into two combative camps. There were posters on one side reading "Justice for the wives," and he stole their futures. There were equally boisterous voices on the other shouting with signs that read, "Free Kody," and "Families clash. This is not a crime." The media swarmed like vultures, cameras flashing, microphones thrust into the air, desperate to capture the reactions that would shape the headlines. Inside, the tension only grew thicker with each passing hour. The wives stole glances at each other. Silent battles waged in their eyes. Christine's fury, Janelle's bitterness, Meri's sorrow, Robyn's fragile loyalty. All of it played out in quiet moments, as they waited for the strangers to decide their story's ending. At last, as the fading light seeped in through the high windows, the doors swung open. The jury returned, pale, their faces inscrutable. The foreperson held a crumpled piece of paper, the heavy weight of the choice pulling at their fingers. The courtroom paused, as if even the air would not move. The judge pushed his glasses up, his tone firm but quiet. Has the jury reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honor, the foreperson responded, their voice shaking just a little. Please turn the verdict over to the bailiff. The sheet was handed forward, a folded piece of paper that contained the ability to destroy or redeem. The judge unfolded it slowly, his eyes reading the words before he nodded. He passed it back to the foreperson. Please read the verdict aloud. Kody's chest tightened. Robyn clasped her hands together, whispering under her breath. Christine's head lifted sharply, her body rigid. Janelle's jaw clenched. Meri closed her eyes. The gallery leaned forward, reporters' pens poised, the world balanced on a knife's edge. The foreperson rose, the slip shaking in his hand. The stillness was agony, the sort which screamed louder than any tempest. At last came the words, rattling against the walls of the courtroom. On the charges of fraud and deception, we find the defendant. The silence was interminable. Each beat in the room reverberated, thumping like a drumhead. The wives gripped the armrests of their chairs. Kody's lawyer leaned forward, lips open, poised to pounce on whatever was to come. The judge's eyes darted to the foreperson, nudging them to proceed. We find the defendant. The word dangled there, poised like a guillotine over the head of Kody. Gasps circulated through the gallery, folks standing half up from their seats, as if attempting to pull the verdict into the air themselves. The journalists almost lost their pens with anticipation. On the outside, the chants roared louder, though no one indoors was able to hear the verdict yet. Kody's lips moved soundlessly, shaping a prayer, a plea, a curse. No one could say. Robyn clamped her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. Christine's chest labored, her nails pressing into her palms. Janelle's face turned hard as stone. Meri mouthed something only she could hear. The foreperson's mouth creaked open once more, prepared to let out the last word that would end Kody's dominance as patriarch forever. And then silence. The screen of the story fades to black dot undefined. The audience is left with the last question echoing in their minds. Guilty or not guilty? What will become of Kody Brown?